Detective Agatha Marple, Murder on the Cunard Line Cruise Ship, a Detective Mystery Tales. The Cunard Line ship, a stately floating palace of the 1920s, stood gleaming at its moorings, a marvel of modern luxury. The polished brass railings glinted under the overcast sky, and the marble floors, perpetually attended by the uniformed staff, promised a smooth glide into the world of refined leisure. As Detective Agatha Marple stepped aboard, her sensible leather suitcase in hand, she allowed herself a moment's pause to take it all in. There was an art to the grandeur of such vessels, an art that rested on the surface, inviting scrutiny, even as the depths beneath remained unknowable. She was greeted by the ship's purser, a middle-aged man whose well-pressed uniform and brisk manner suggested he had handled more than his fair share of passengers who thought themselves rather important. He bowed slightly, extending an arm toward the grand staircase that rose from the ship's lobby. "If you'll follow me, Miss Marple, your cabin is ready and your luggage will be brought shortly." "Thank you," Agatha replied, her voice as measured and unassuming as her appearance. She followed the purser up the staircase, her eyes flicking over her fellow travellers. They passed a woman standing in the middle of the lobby like a queen holding court. She was glamorous in every respect, dripping with diamonds, her figure wrapped in a gown of cobalt silk. A feathered hat perched jauntily on her blonde curls, and her lips were painted a shade of crimson that seemed to demand attention. Her voice carried in clipped, refined tones as she spoke to an admirer. "Of course, darling, it's my third crossing this year. One simply can't let one's feet get too settled on solid ground." The woman turned her head slightly, and Agatha caught a sharp glint in her sapphire-blue eyes that suggested the socialite's effortless charm might just as easily cut to the quick. Farther along, a man in his early 30s appeared at the top of the stairs, clutching a leather case from which the corner of a sheet of music protruded. He looked as if he had just come from a jazz club on the left bank, rather than the polished deck of a luxury cruise liner. His frame was wiry, his dark skin glowing softly under the lights. With an air of casual confidence, he nodded at the purser, then glanced briefly at Agatha. A quick, charming smile flitted across his face before he turned away, the brass of his instrument case winking like a silent note in the melody of the ship's chatter. The purser led Agatha past another passenger, a man of middle age with olive-toned skin and hair slicked neatly back, his suit impeccable and his shoes reflecting the light with the perfection of a museum exhibit. He was speaking in low tones to a steward, his eyes sharp and calculating. For a moment his gaze flicked to Agatha. She met it, allowing herself the faintest of polite smiles. He nodded briefly and resumed his conversation, the lines at the corners of his mouth barely moving, as if every word he spoke was carefully weighed. Finally they passed a woman standing near the rail, a small leather-bound notebook pressed tightly to her chest. She was slight, pale, with a sprinkling of freckles and auburn hair pinned into a neat bun. Her attire was plain, grey tweeds, sturdy shoes, but her posture was that of someone acutely aware of her surroundings. She glanced at Agatha only briefly before quickly averting her eyes and slipping away down the corridor toward her cabin. Agatha, seemingly indifferent, was quietly taking it all in. Each passenger was a tiny figure on a vast chessboard, each movement noted and tucked away for future reference. When the purser stopped at her cabin, she thanked him, entered, and shut the door behind her. The room was, as expected, tastefully furnished. The bed was dressed in crisp white linens. The brass fixtures gleamed against the dark wood panelling. A porthole framed a grey, churning sky, a reminder of the unpredictable sea journey ahead. After setting her suitcase on the stand, Agatha unpacked slowly, placing a modest wardrobe into the drawers and hanging a sensible coat in the closet. Once everything was in order, she stepped back into the corridor and ascended to the observation deck. The air was cool and carried the faint tang of salt. Here the grandeur of the ship gave way to a feeling of exposure, the openness of the deck bordered only by the distant horizon. A few passengers lingered, their voices low. Agatha moved along the railing, pausing to gaze out at the sea, and caught fragments of conversation that floated like flotsam on the breeze. "You mustn't tell anyone." I'm certain it was meant for her, not me. You can't imagine what would happen if the wrong person finds out." Agatha turned her head slightly, as if admiring the passing waves. Her face betrayed nothing, but her mind was already at work. The first evening aboard was far too early for trouble. Yet already the ship seemed to hum with the whispers of hidden agendas. The grand ballroom of the Cunard ship was unrecognizable in its evening splendor. The usual polished wood panelling and brass fixtures now shimmered under the warm glow of crystal chandeliers. A string quartet perched at one end of the room played a lilting waltz that seemed to float on the air, mingling with the soft rustle of evening gowns and the hum of polite conversation. Round tables draped in pristine white cloths held glistening glassware and arrangements of pale roses. Footmen in crisp livery moved among the guests, offering champagne flutes on silver trays. Agatha Marple stood near the edge of the room, her plain yet elegant gown blending easily into the background. She wore no jewels, no feathers, just a simple strand of pearls that caught the light when she tilted her head ever so slightly. Her sharp blue eyes moved slowly over the scene, missing nothing. Near the centre of the ballroom stood the socialite, her cobalt gown pooling around her feet like a spill of silk. Her laughter rang out above the music, directed at a young officer who was clearly basking in her attention. She leaned in as she spoke, gesturing grandly with her champagne flute, her diamond bracelet catching the light with each movement. People gathered around her, drawn to her sparkling wit and seemingly effortless charm. By the piano the musician's fingers danced over the keys in a jazzy rendition of the waltz, drawing scattered applause from nearby tables. His head bobbed faintly in time with the music, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. Though his tune was lively, his dark eyes swept the room with practised ease, lingering here and there as if taking measure of the audience. Against the far wall, the art dealer and the academic hovered on the outskirts of the revelry. The art dealer, glass in hand, leaned against a pillar with an air of practised nonchalance. His hair gleamed under the chandeliers, and his sharp profile was framed by the glow of the candle sconces. He watched the crowd with a detached intensity, his gaze occasionally flicking to the socialite before quickly returning to his drink. The academic, seated nearby, cradled a delicate flute of champagne. Her eyes never left the table, her freckled hands tightening slightly on the glass whenever someone approached. She seemed to shrink into herself, as if wishing to become invisible among the glittering crowd. As Agatha's gaze moved between the guests, the ballroom's gilded doors opened. A hush fell over one corner of the room as a young woman stepped inside. Her entrance was hardly dramatic, no fanfare, no announcement, but there was something about her that drew notice. She was younger than most of the passengers present, perhaps in her early 20s, and clearly not from their world. Her gown, though lovely, was simpler, and her expression held no trace of practised charm. She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to a stage rather than a dance floor, and her presence seemed to carry a whisper of unease. The woman's eyes swept the room before they settled on the art dealer. For a moment the two regarded each other, and the air seemed to still. The art dealer's glass paused halfway to his lips. His features remained calm, but his sharp gaze darkened, just for a second, before he turned away. The woman's expression didn't change, but her shoulders tightened, and she broke eye contact, moving quickly toward the rear of the ballroom. Agatha noted the exchange, her lips pressing into a faint line. The tiniest crease formed at the corner of her eye. The moment had been brief, easily missed amid the glitter and laughter of the gala, but it had been there. She turned back to her glass of sherry and sipped, letting the music and chatter wash over her. Her expression betrayed no outward curiosity, but she'd tucked the detail away. The waltz ended, and a polite ripple of applause followed. The socialite led her entourage toward the floor for the next dance. The musician shifted into a playful tune, and the atmosphere resumed its lively chatter. Agatha stood motionless for a moment longer, her gaze lingering on the far door, where the young woman had vanished. Then she turned her attention back to the crowd, her sharp mind already drawing lines between people who, on the surface, seemed to share nothing more than a pleasant evening aboard a ship. The Cunard Line, for all its opulence, could hardly be described as peaceful in the hours past midnight. Even so, the piercing scream that tore through the quiet corridors brought an unnatural silence in its wake, a silence so abrupt and profound that Agatha Marple found herself sitting upright in bed before she'd fully registered what she'd heard. She had spent years honing her instincts, and tonight they screamed louder than any cry. Agatha dressed swiftly, pulling on her robe and slipping her feet into sturdy slippers. Outside her cabin, the corridor was already filling with people in varying states of dishevelment, faces half covered by hastily tied scarves, robes clutching their frames. They moved toward the source of the commotion with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Agatha joined the stream, her steps measured, her expression calm. She moved through the crowd with a sense of purpose, weaving past startled passengers and stewards, speaking in hushed tones. The sense of claustrophobia within the ship's narrow corridors heightened the tension. Walls lined with polished wood gleamed faintly under dim, flickering lights, making each shadow stretch longer and more menacing. The murmurs grew louder as she neared the first-class suites. One door stood ajar, spilling light into the hallway. The crowd gathered outside parted as Agatha approached, revealing the socialites' lavish suite. The scent of fresh roses placed on her table each evening mingled with a faint metallic tang that Agatha recognized all too well. The socialite stood to one side, her cobalt robe clutched tightly around her, her face pale but composed. Her hand rested on a steward's arm as if steadying herself. "It's ghastly," she murmured, her tone sharp but controlled. Agatha stepped through the doorway. The room, still immaculate in its grandeur, bore no signs of struggle. No overturned chairs, no shattered glass. Everything was as it had been only hours earlier, when Agatha herself had passed by on her evening walk. Everything except for the young woman sprawled on the carpet near the foot of the sofa. It was the dancer from the gala, the girl who had locked eyes with the art dealer. Her graceful limbs were now unnaturally still, her delicate pastel gown stained dark with blood at her side. Agatha's eyes moved over the scene. The pristine lace hem of the girl's dress, the glint of jewelry that caught the light, the pale curve of her wrist lying motionless against the carpet. The wound, sharp, precise, suggested a single deliberate motion. By the time the ship's doctor arrived, the passengers were huddling in clumps, speaking in strained whispers. He knelt beside the body, his brow furrowing as he examined her. After a few minutes he rose, brushing his hands against his coat, as if to shake away the gravity of the scene. "I'm afraid she's gone," he said quietly. A collective intake of breath swept through the onlookers, followed by an uneasy silence. The socialite whispered something to the steward, who nodded and stepped aside. Agatha, standing slightly apart from the others, took in every detail. The room's stillness was unnatural, almost staged. The absence of a struggle, the precision of the wound. It all spoke to a killer who knew exactly what they were doing. She glanced at the girl's empty hands, then at the faint indentation on the nearby side table where an object had once rested. The dagger, Agatha recognized the style from the gala, was missing. As passengers murmured and a steward moved to close the door, Agatha stepped back, her keen blue eyes flicking over the faces of those nearby. The socialite's hand still trembled on the steward's sleeve. A man who'd arrived late, Agatha noted the subtle mark of ink smudged on his cuff, stared a moment too long before averting his gaze. Another passenger whispered furiously to her companion, their hands twisting at the fabric of their robe, and then there was the silence. The weighted, pregnant silence that seemed to press against the walls of the grand suite. Agatha took it all in, her thoughts turning over the scene in slow, deliberate waves. The dagger might have been missing, but the room itself was speaking, and Agatha Marple always listened. When the ship's captain arrived, it was as though order reasserted itself through sheer presence. Captain Fairweather's crisp white uniform, unmarred by the late hour, gleamed under the cabin's subdued light. He carried himself with the deliberate precision of a man used to commanding attention, his polished boots clicking softly on the parquet floor as he stepped into the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice calm yet firm. "Please return to your cabins. I assure you we will handle this matter with the utmost discretion." His glance fell on the purser, a balding man who seemed ready to faint from the strain of maintaining composure. "Secure the area, and ensure no one enters or leaves without my permission." The purser nodded hastily, stepping forward to shoo the remaining onlookers toward the door. Murmurs rose again, but the crowd began to dissipate in uneven ripples, leaving only the faint scent of perfume and cigar smoke behind. Agatha lingered at the edge of the room, her expression unreadable. She adjusted the lace trim of her robe, making her presence known without being obtrusive. The captain turned to her, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took her measure. "Captain," she said, stepping forward at last, "I believe I may be of some assistance. I'm a retired investigator, one who has handled matters like this before." She kept her tone light, almost conversational, though her gaze remained steady on his. Fairweather's frown deepened. "Madam, I appreciate the offer, but this is a matter for the authorities. We'll alert the port officials as soon as we dock." "Of course, and I don't mean to interfere," Agatha replied smoothly, "but until that time it might be useful to gather some preliminary information. Before details grow hazy, memories shift. A quiet word with a few key individuals now could save considerable time later." For a long moment the captain studied her. His reputation as a fair but no-nonsense leader preceded him, and it was clear he was weighing the wisdom of allowing an amateur, however genteel, to involve herself. Finally he nodded. "Very well," he said, "but I expect you to keep things discreet. No accusations, no undue alarm. You may begin interviewing the passengers after we've fully secured the scene." His tone left no room for negotiation. "Understood," Agatha replied. She folded her hands in front of her, a picture of quiet deference, though her mind was already racing through the faces she had seen earlier that evening. As the remaining passengers filed out, Agatha observed them with a critical eye. The socialite, who had been the centre of attention only hours before, now looked pale and shaken, her hands clutching the collar of her robe, as though she had felt the dagger's blade herself. The musician, typically so self-assured, stood with his shoulders slightly hunched, his hands buried deep in his pockets. The art dealer, whose polished manners had made him a picture of composure, now avoided meeting anyone's gaze, his brow faintly glistening, and the academic, poor nervous thing, clutched her notebook tightly, as if the world would fall apart should she let it go. Agatha noted it all, her sharp eyes catching every flicker of expression, every unspoken word. The details seemed small now, but she had learned long ago that the truth often rested in the smallest, most overlooked gestures. And so she waited, calmly, as the ship's staff closed the doors and the passengers dispersed. Agatha Marple's time would come soon enough. Agatha Marple sat comfortably in the socialites' first-class suite, the very picture of calm observation. The grand room was in perfect order, thick velvet drapes tied back with golden cords, a marble-topped vanity adorned with crystal perfume bottles, and a plush cream-coloured armchair in which the socialite now sat, looking pale but composed. Dressed in her exquisite evening gown, a shimmering cobalt number that caught the light at every angle, the socialite was clutching a delicate lace handkerchief. Her lips, painted a rich crimson, formed a tight line as she stared at the empty glass in her hands. Agatha noted the tremble in her fingers, the stiffness in her shoulders. "I'm sorry you had to be roused at such an hour," Agatha began, her voice polite but cool. "If you could just clarify—" "I told the captain everything already," the socialite interrupted, her tone clipped. "I was on the observation deck at the time of the incident, meeting a friend. That's all there is to it." "And this friend's name?" Agatha asked, her tone still even. "I really can't say." The socialite waved the handkerchief lightly, as if to dispel the question. "He's married, you understand. It would be most unseemly to bring him into this." Agatha said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch. The socialite glanced up, her sapphire-blue eyes flicking to the window and then back to Agatha. "I heard footsteps outside my suite when I returned," she added hastily. just before the scream, but I didn't see anyone. I went straight to the deck after dinner and returned directly here." "Directly here?" Agatha echoed, her gaze steady, "and yet the steward places you back in your suite a good half-hour before the scream was heard. A curious detail, don't you think?" The socialite's composure faltered just slightly, an almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw, a flicker of her eyes. "The steward must be mistaken. I was on the deck. The sea air helps me think. It's a pity," Agatha said lightly, "that your pearl-handled dagger is missing." She leaned back slightly, the hint of a smile on her lips. "A rather distinctive piece. Surely you recall having it here on your dressing-table yesterday?" The socialite stiffened. "I don't know what you're implying, Miss Marple, but I'm hardly the only person on board with a taste for fine things. Perhaps someone else admired it too much." "Indeed," Agatha said. "I find that taste often leads us into unexpected situations." She rose, smoothing her skirts. "Thank you, my dear. I won't keep you any longer. I'm sure the captain will be satisfied with your account." The socialite inclined her head, her expression unreadable, but as Agatha left the suite, she allowed herself the smallest smile. The inconsistencies were there, as plain as the pearls around the socialite's neck. The question was, where would they lead next? The piano lounge was deserted, save for its lone occupant, the musician, who sat at the polished grand piano in the corner. The room's rich mahogany panelling and subdued golden light gave it a muted elegance, though the late hour rendered it eerily quiet. The musician's fingers hovered over the keys, but he played nothing. Instead, he fidgeted, tapping out uneven rhythms against the bench, shifting his weight back and forth. When Agatha entered, her presence seemed to heighten his unease. "Please continue if you like," Agatha said mildly, seating herself at a nearby table. She smoothed her skirts and regarded him with a small, polite smile. "I do enjoy a bit of music." His hands dropped to his lap. "I'd rather not," he muttered. His accent had a faint southern lilt, though his voice was subdued. "Not right now." Agatha let the silence stretch for a moment before she spoke again. "You said you were practicing on deck when the scream was heard." He nodded quickly. "That's right, on the promenade deck." "And can anyone confirm that?" He shifted on the bench again, running his hands along the edge of his trousers. "I don't know. It was late. Maybe someone saw me, maybe not." Agatha studied him without a hint of reproach. "Odd that no one remembers. It's usually hard to miss someone playing a tune so late at night." "I wasn't playing." He glanced at her sharply, his shoulders stiffening. "I was just thinking, clearing my head." She tilted her head slightly, as if considering the statement. Thinking about what? He hesitated, his dark eyes flickering away from hers. "Nothing, just life." "Did you happen to see anyone else out there?" His fingers gripped the edge of the bench. "No, ma'am." Her gaze fell briefly to his hands, then back to his face. "You seem nervous," she said gently. "Why is that?" "I'm not nervous," he said too quickly, his voice rising slightly. "I told you I don't know anything about what happened." Agatha regarded him calmly, her voice dropping to a softer tone. "You do seem unsettled, though. I can understand that. A tragedy like this—" She paused, allowing the words to linger. "People sometimes say things that might not seem important at first, but later they prove to be." The musician's shoulders sagged slightly. He rubbed his palms against his knees. "Look," he said after a long silence. "The girl, she came to me earlier, before the gala." Agatha's expression didn't change, though her mind immediately sharpened. "What did she say?" "She asked me about someone," he admitted reluctantly. "A passenger." "Which passenger?" "I don't know." He shook his head, frustration evident. "I mean, I know who, but I didn't tell her anything. I don't get mixed up in other people's business." "And what did you say to her?" "I told her to leave me alone," he said. "I told her I didn't want to hear about it. I didn't want to get involved." He rubbed the back of his neck, his voice dropping. "But she was upset, really upset." Agatha studied him closely. "So you think she might have confided in someone else?" He didn't answer, staring down at the piano keys as though they might hold the answer. You must have a good reason for not naming this passenger," Agatha said, her tone still gentle. "Perhaps you're afraid of making a mistake, of putting someone in a difficult position, or perhaps you're worried about what might happen to you if you do." He shifted again, then finally stood, his posture tense. "I don't know anything that'll help you, that's all I can say." Agatha rose slowly, smoothing her skirts again. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You've been very helpful." As she turned to leave, the musician called after her, his voice taut. "I didn't hurt her, you know. I don't want you thinking that." Agatha paused at the door, looking back at him. "I'm not here to make assumptions," she replied simply. "I'm only here to find the truth." She left him standing by the piano, his silhouette framed by the room's dim golden light. The lounge returned to silence, save for the faint creak of the bench as he finally sat down again, his hands resting heavily on the closed lid. Agatha's inquiries began, as so many inquiries do, with a seemingly innocuous detail. The purser, a harried man who had grown steadily paler over the course of the day, answered her questions with a mixture of nervous energy and an eagerness to please. His job was to maintain the veneer of luxury and tranquillity aboard the Cunard Line, and the sudden spectre of murder had rendered him positively tremulous. Miss Geraldine, you said?" the purser stammered, smoothing his pocket-watch chain with trembling fingers. "No, she wasn't a regular member of our staff, only boarded just before we set sail, a last-minute hire from our entertainment agency." He glanced about as if the ship's very walls might be listening. "We'd had a sudden cancellation. Someone fell ill at the last minute." "And the agency sent her in their place?" Agatha asked, her voice calm, almost disinterested. "Yes, precisely," he said. "She was only supposed to be with us for this voyage. Temporary, you see." Agatha's eyes narrowed slightly. A new face aboard, one who hadn't yet settled into the rhythms of shipboard life. Temporary positions, she mused, often came with temporary allegiances. Did she mention anything unusual during her time here?" Agatha prompted. "A passenger she took a particular interest in, perhaps?" "Oh, no, miss. She wasn't with us long enough for that sort of thing. Kept to herself most of the time when she wasn't performing." The purser adjusted his cufflinks nervously. "Quiet girl, a bit reserved." "Thank you," Agatha said. She gave him a polite smile that did nothing to reassure him and turned to leave. The dancers' quarters, tucked away among the crew's accommodations, were a stark contrast to the first-class opulence above. A small utilitarian space, barely large enough for a bed and a wardrobe, it was nonetheless neatly kept. The narrow porthole admitted a dim shaft of daylight. Agatha surveyed the surroundings with her usual detached thoroughness. Her gaze lingered on the bed, its thin blanket folded with military precision, and the single trunk at the foot, the latch slightly askew. On the bedside table rested a plain silver hairbrush, a small tin of face powder, and a compact mirror. Nothing out of the ordinary. It was the pillow that caught her attention. Beneath it, neatly tucked away, lay a small leather journal. Agatha's eyes narrowed as she picked it up. The binding was smooth and well-worn, suggesting it had been handled frequently. The pages within were filled with a hurried, looping script, punctuated by the occasional doodle, flowers, stars, abstract pattern. She turned the pages slowly, her eyes scanning the entries. Many were ordinary reflections. Sunny day. The sea looks endless. Or, met some passengers after the show, they seemed nice. But then the tone shifted. A single list, hastily jotted down, caught her attention. Initials. "Murbatog," said James. Agatha's brow furrowed. She recognized several of those initials. Passengers she'd spoken to, names that had come up in passing. But what was their connection? Why were they noted here in this furtive, cramped hand? She continued flipping through the journal until she reached the last few entries. One line, scrawled as though in haste, leapt off the page. "SDD, meeting midnight, last chance." Agatha frowned. SD. Those initials didn't match any of the names she had encountered thus far. A pseudonym? A coded reference? Or was there someone aboard the ship she had yet to meet? Tucking the journal back under the pillow, she stepped out of the small room and into the narrow corridor. The air felt colder here, the muted hum of the ship's engine more pronounced. She tightened her shawl around her shoulders. A young woman arriving just before departure, a list of initials, some familiar, some not, a meeting at midnight, last chance. Agatha's mind churned through the possibilities, though she kept her face calm, her expression neutral. The clues were there, she knew they were. All she needed to do was fit them together. Afternoon sunlight filtered through the thin mist that clung to the ship, painting the deck in a muted palette of grey and gold. Agatha Marple strolled along the promenade, her steps unhurried, her gaze as sharp as ever. The steady rhythm of the ocean's waves provided a soothing backdrop to the hushed conversations of scattered passengers. It was a pleasant enough scene, but Agatha knew from long experience that even the most serene settings could hide discord. As she rounded a corner, she paused. Just ahead, near the entrance to one of the lower decks, the art dealer and the academic stood in close conference. The art dealer, his hair slicked back and his shoes glinting in the faint sunlight, held a small, unmarked package. He glanced over his shoulder, his manner unusually furtive. The academic clutched her ever-present notebook to her chest, her pale features tense as she listened. Agatha watched from a distance, careful to keep her silhouette obscured behind a wooden support beam. The conversation between the two was brief, punctuated by hurried gestures. At one point, the art dealer thrust the package into the academic's hands, his tone sharp, though the words were lost to the distance. The academic nodded quickly, glanced around nervously, and then walked away, clutching the package as if it were a lifeline. The art dealer stood for a moment longer, adjusting his jacket and running a hand through his hair before retreating in the opposite direction. Agatha remained still, her gaze thoughtful. Such exchanges could mean little, or they could mean everything. Agatha found the academic a short while later in the ship's library, seated at a table piled high with reference books. Her notebook lay open, but her pen hovered hesitantly above the page. She looked up with a start as Agatha approached. "Miss Montague," Agatha said with a pleasant smile, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "No, not at all," the academic replied, though her voice wavered. She closed her notebook hastily. "I was wondering if you might answer a small question," Agatha continued, her tone casual. "I happened to notice you speaking with Mr. Blake on deck earlier. He seemed quite intent. Something about a parcel, I believe?" The academic's fingers tightened around her pen. "Oh, that. Yes. He asked me to hold on to something for him, just for safekeeping." "What sort of item?" "Just a personal item." The academic glanced away, her eyes darting to the rows of bookshelves as though seeking an escape. Agatha's smile didn't falter. "How kind of you to help him. I'm sure there's nothing unusual about it." She tilted her head slightly. "Though I must say, Mr. Blake did look rather agitated when he handed it over. Is it something valuable, perhaps?" The academic hesitated, then shook her head. "No, it's not valuable, just something he wanted out of sight for a while, that's all." "Of course," Agatha said gently. "Still, it's odd he would choose you. I wasn't aware you knew each other particularly well." "We don't," the academic admitted, "but he said he trusted me to be discreet." "Discretion is always admirable," Agatha replied. She gave the academic a polite nod. "Thank you for your time, Miss Montague. I hope your studies prove fruitful." As she left the library, Agatha's expression turned thoughtful. The academic's evasiveness was unmistakable. Whatever was in that package, it wasn't just a personal item. It was something the academic was reluctant, even afraid, to discuss. Back in the socialites' suite, Agatha once again stood amid the opulence. The room had been left untouched since the captain's inspection, but with the initial flurry of activity over, it felt quieter, more revealing. The late afternoon light streaming through the tall windows illuminated details she hadn't noticed before. Agatha's sharp eyes drifted over the vanity, the pristine surface of the bed, and finally to the dresser against the wall. It was there that she spotted something, a faint smear just visible against the rich, dark wood. Stepping closer, she examined it carefully. A thin trace of blood ran along the back edge of the dresser, faint but unmistakable. It was in a place easily overlooked, suggesting the body might have been moved, dragged perhaps from another part of the room. This contradicted the earlier assumption that the victim had collapsed where she was found. Agatha reached into her pocket and pulled out a clean handkerchief. She dabbed the smear lightly, confirming its nature, then stepped back. A small detail, but a telling one. Someone had altered the scene, and that someone was now hiding not just their actions, but perhaps their very identity. Her mind worked quickly, sorting through the facts and impressions gathered so far. The art dealer's secretive exchange, the academic's unease, and now this overlooked blood smear. The puzzle was still incomplete, but the edges were starting to take shape. The Atlantic storm had been brewing for hours, its rising swells and howling winds battering the Cunard Line as it cut through the open sea. Passengers, confined to their cabins, listened to the ship groan and shudder with each wave, the occasional crash of unsecured furniture adding to the din. Down in the lower decks, the crew scrambled to stabilize loose equipment, latching boxes and fastening doors that threatened to swing open under the relentless motion. In the crew's storage room, a sharp lurch of the ship sent a stack of crates tumbling. Among the scattered contents, coils of rope, cans of oil, and cleaning rags, one steward stumbled upon something that shouldn't have been there. A pearl-handled dagger gleaming faintly in the dim light. It lay partially concealed beneath a heavy coil of maritime cable. As though hastily stowed and forgotten, the steward hesitated only briefly before retrieving it and reporting his discovery to the purser, who in turn informed the captain. Word travelled quickly, and within the hour Agatha Marple was brought down to inspect the weapon. The storage room was cramped, its air thick with the tang of salt and oil. Agatha stepped carefully over the disarrayed crates, her eyes narrowing as the steward held out the dagger in a cloth. The handle was exquisite, polished mother-of-pearl set into gold fittings, and the blade, though dulled by a light sheen of corrosion, was still keen enough to draw blood. "Found it just back there," the steward said, pointing to the pile of fallen supplies. "Didn't think it belonged among our tools, so I—" "Very astute of you," Agatha said gently, cutting him off with a faint smile, "and quite right to bring it to our attention." She turned the dagger over in her gloved hands, studying it in the weak light. Blood still clung to the blade, though it had dried to a dark rust colour. Her attention, however, lingered on the faint streaks near the hilt. Something slick and faintly pungent clung there, a residue that glistened under the lamplight. "What's this?" she murmured, leaning closer. The purser, standing nervously to one side, glanced down at the weapon. "That might be from the cleaning supplies, ma'am. We use a particular solvent for the brass fittings. Strong stuff. Wouldn't find it anywhere else on the ship, though." "Interesting," Agatha said, slipping the dagger into a cloth and tucking it carefully away. "If this were simply a weapon left behind, one might expect it to be clean. A killer would have every reason to wipe it down, remove any incriminating traces. But here we have blood and solvent, as though someone handled it in haste before hiding it." The purser shifted uncomfortably. "You think it was one of the crew?" he asked hesitantly. Agatha smiled faintly. "No, I don't believe so. Crew members would know better than to leave a weapon where it might be found so easily. This is a deliberate move, one meant to cast suspicion where it does not belong." She turned, her gaze sharp. "This dagger was not just hidden. It was placed here, among the crew's tools, in a location where someone thought it might later be discovered. Someone with an interest in shifting blame away from the first-class deck." The storm howled louder outside, shaking the ship's frame as Agatha made her way back up the narrow staircase. The dagger was an important piece of the puzzle, not because of where it was found, but because of what it implied. A plan, a motive, and, perhaps most importantly, an effort to misdirect. It was not the final clue, but it was enough to confirm what Agatha had already suspected. The passengers in their luxurious cabins above were not merely witnesses to this crime. Among them were those who had schemed and conspired to commit it. And now, as the storm began to ease, Agatha's own storm of questions came into focus. She would uncover the truth, and soon. The grand salon was unusually still as the passengers filed in one by one, their steps muffled by the lush carpet. The towering crystal chandeliers cast soft, shifting patterns of light across the polished wood panels, creating an atmosphere that was both serene and tense. This was no ordinary gathering for cocktails or light conversation. This was a reckoning. Agatha Marple sat near the centre of the room, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had asked each of the key figures to join her, and now she waited, her expression calm but her eyes sharp. The socialite arrived first, her cobalt gown as immaculate as ever, though her face was pale and drawn. She avoided Agatha's gaze as she took a seat. The musician entered next, his usual charm diminished, his movements nervous and uncertain. The art dealer followed, his polished shoes clicking softly against the floor, his face an unreadable mask. Finally the academic appeared, clutching her ever-present notebook to her chest, her gaze darting nervously around the room. When all were seated, Agatha rose, her small frame commanding an unexpected authority. "I've asked you here because, as you know, there has been a grave incident aboard this ship. A young woman lost her life, and it is clear that this was no accident." The room was silent, save for the faint creak of the ship's timbers. Agatha allowed the pause to settle before continuing. "We begin with the victim, Miss Geraldine as we knew her. A dancer in the ship's entertainment troupe, yes, but that was not her true purpose here." Agatha's gaze swept the room. Miss Geraldine was, in fact, an undercover investigator, sent to gather evidence on a smuggling ring operating aboard this very vessel. There were gasps from the assembled suspects. The socialite stiffened, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair. The musician's eyes widened, his fingers twitching as though he longed to play a chord to dispel the tension. The art dealer's mouth tightened, but he remained silent. The academic simply blinked rapidly, her notebook pressed even closer to her chest. "She was clever," Agatha continued, her voice steady. "She made her inquiries discreetly, befriended passengers who might have information, and took careful notes. Unfortunately, cleverness can also be dangerous. She became a threat, both to the smuggling operation and to other secrets aboard this ship." Agatha turned her gaze to the socialite. "Miss Dubois, you claimed to be on the observation deck when the scream was heard. However, the steward placed you in your suite well before that time. Your alibi does not hold." The socialite's lips parted as though to protest, but Agatha held up a hand. "What's more, you had every reason to fear exposure. Miss Geraldine had discovered certain indiscretions, financial dealings, personal matters, that would have ruined your reputation, and so you saw her as a liability." The socialite's face flushed a deep red, but she remained silent, her knuckles white as she gripped the chair. Agatha's gaze shifted to the art. "And you, Mr. Blake, you claim to know nothing of the dancer, yet I saw you hand a package to Miss Montague, a package containing artifacts that were not, shall we say, yours to possess. You knew Miss Geraldine had uncovered your operation, and you feared she would expose you?" The art dealer's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. His jaw tightened, and his eyes narrowed. Still he said nothing. Agatha turned to the academic. "Miss Montague, I believe you were an unwitting accomplice. You carried those artifacts without knowing their origins, trusting Mr. Blake's assurances. However, that trust put you at the centre of this dangerous game. While I do not believe you had a hand in the murder, your involvement cannot be ignored." The academic's voice trembled as she spoke for the first time. "I didn't know. I only carried them because he asked. I had no idea what they were." "I believe you," Agatha said gently. "But your role in this web of lies made you a part of the larger story." She returned her attention to the room as a whole. "And here we come to the heart of it. Miss Geraldine knew too much. She had uncovered not one, but two significant secrets. The socialite acted to protect her reputation and her financial standing. The art dealer acted to protect his smuggling enterprise. Each, unaware of the other's plan, sought to silence her, and in their separate schemes they converged." A heavy silence filled the room. Outside, the waves lapped steadily against the hull, a rhythmic reminder of the world beyond the salon's walls. Agatha's voice softened. Greed, fear, and desperation. These are the motives that led to her death. But now the truth is laid bare. The evidence, the inconsistencies, the lies, they all lead back to you. The socialite's head bowed slightly. The art dealer's mask of indifference finally cracked, revealing a flicker of something that might have been regret. The academic remained frozen, her notebook clutched tightly, as though it could shield her from the weight of the revelations. Agatha stood silent for a moment, her calm gaze sweeping over the room. Then she stepped back, her part in the unfolding drama complete. The passengers sat motionless, the ship's steady rhythm the only sound as the truth sank in. The storm that had raged around the Cunard Line ship had calmed, leaving behind a misty quiet. The Atlantic stretched endlessly into the pale horizon, the rhythmic slap of waves against the hull, the only sound now that the tension had lifted. Agatha Marple stood near the window of the captain's private office, her sharp eyes fixed on the horizon. Behind her, Captain Fairweather poured himself a measure of brandy before offering one to Agatha, who politely declined. "Well, Miss Marple," the captain said, sinking into the high-backed chair behind his desk, "you've done what neither the purser nor I could manage. It seems the truth has come out at last." He took a slow sip of his drink. "But now I must ask, what do we do about it?" Agatha turned from the window, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "That depends, Captain," she replied evenly. "You could alert the authorities immediately, radio ahead to the nearest port, and have them intercept the ship. That would ensure swift justice, but at a cost." She gestured vaguely at the ship around them. "A scandal, particularly one involving first-class passengers, would ruin not only the reputations of the guilty, but also cast a shadow over the entire voyage. It would taint the Cunard Line itself." The captain frowned. "And the alternative?" "Handle the matter quietly," Agatha said. "Let us complete the journey to New York. Inform the authorities there in private. By then the story can be controlled. The guilty parties will be dealt with, and the rest of the passengers, many of whom are entirely innocent, can disembark none the wiser." Captain Fairweather stared into his brandy for a moment. "I suppose there's a certain wisdom in discretion," he said, his tone reluctant. "But do you not think it's our duty to make an example of them, to show that no one is above the law?" Agatha tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. "It is precisely because we have a duty to justice that we must tread carefully," she replied. "Justice that ruins the innocent is no justice at all. The passengers who know nothing of these crimes should not have their names dragged through the mud. The crew, who are blameless in this matter, should not bear the burden of suspicion. Sometimes, Captain, the right course is not the loudest or the quickest. It is the one that allows the truth to emerge without undue harm." The captain sighed heavily and nodded. "Very well, we'll take them into custody discreetly in New York. I trust you'll assist in ensuring everything is properly documented." "Of course," Agatha said with a faint smile. "I'll provide my notes and any statements needed. By the time we dock, the authorities will know precisely who is to be held accountable." Fairweather rose, extending his hand. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I dare say you've saved this ship more than you know." Agatha took his hand briefly, then turned to leave. As she walked back toward her cabin, her thoughts turned inward. The guilty parties would face their punishment, but the web of motives still weighed on her mind. Greed, fear, desperation. Those emotions did not vanish with the closing of a case. Would their exposure prevent future harm, or simply drive others to hide their sins more carefully? She paused by a window, her sharp gaze scanning the vast ocean. The ship continued forward, its sleek hull cutting through the water with steady determination. Above all else, life moved on, unyielding and unsentimental. Agatha allowed herself the smallest of smiles. For now, justice would be served in the quiet, measured way she preferred. What ripples it might cause in the future, well, only time would tell.